Hello, everyone. I'm back with Dr. Akbar Ahmed. Our series continues, and today we will be discussing a very important concept within the larger Muslim community across the globe, and it is referred to as Asabiyyah. It's an Arabic word with multiple meanings, but in short, it's an idea of group consciousness or sense of community or social cohesion, also used in the context of tribalism and clanism. And I will be asking Dr. Akbar Ahmed to define this term and how it has evolved and shaped and underwritten Muslim societies everywhere since for centuries. And where do we stand today? Because this concept was also popularized by Ibn Khaldun in his groundbreaking Muqaddimah, wherein he described that the fundamental bond of human uh, society and the basic motive force of history was in the nomadic form. And he argued that it is a cyclical concept as well, and correlates to the rise and fall of civilizations. But we'll get into that as we start having a discussion. Dr. Ahmed, welcome back. And I think first, maybe you should let us know your own, through your own studies and research and other writings, how would you define this term and why is this term an idea so important in the history of Muslims?
Thank you, Raza. This is an extremely important topic and unfortunately not very widely discussed or even known because, as you know, societies are formed into different categories. So they have different characteristics. There's agricultural society, there's urban society. We're discussing tribal societies. And you're right to pick up this notion of Asabiyyah, which really is something that Ibn Khaldun emphasized, because this is the core of what holds a tribe together. And how do we define a tribe? We define a tribe through Herder, who was the great German philosopher, the philosopher of tribal society. For him, there were two factors, soil and blood. These two are crucial in terms of defining a tribe. For Ibn Khaldun, it was Asabiyyah, the feeling of community, communal sense. And it is a complex definition because you then have the concept of the shajara. Everyone in the tribe belongs to the lineage. So everyone is related on the lineage and they go back to the ancestor of the tribe. That's why you'll see many of the tribes among the Pathans, for example, will be Yusuf Zai. Zai means the son of, Yusuf Zoi, the descendants of. So even within the tribe, the names are descendants of so-and-so and people trace their ancestry back. Some people trace it as far back as Adam. And of course, there's what anthropologists call fictitious lineage, because you often tend to link your ancestry through those ancestors who are very successful and drop the less successful ones along the way. Now, there are other features of the tribe. There is the notion of hospitality, of courage, honor. There's the notion that tribes generally live in low economic zones. They often live on the periphery. This is very important. Periphery on the borders of two different states, what is called the interstices between states. And the notion in the definition of tribe of revenge. So if one person is killed by another person, how does Asabiyyah respond? It responds by saying an eye for an eye, blood for blood. And that's where the notion of revenge comes in. The notion of revenge is summed up by a very famous Pushtun Pashto matal. Matal is a proverb that I took revenge after 100 years and I took it too soon. And this is not just saying, Raza, there's some dramatic examples. The Viceroy of India, think of it, the Viceroy, the senior most British officer in the colonial era. And as far back as 1872, Lord Mayo, he was visiting the Andaman Islands, he was visiting the prisons of the British Raj, 1872, and a Pushtun from the tribal areas who had been sentenced and sent there, he stabbed him to death. This is in the 19th century. Then, of course, in the 20th century, you have the very famous example of Ajab Khan, who felt he was insulted by the British. He sneaked into Kohat, the Kohat cantonment, and kidnapped Miss Molly Ellis. And that became a very famous case in the British Empire. Imagine in the 1920s, a British girl being kidnapped and taken into the tribal areas. And though she did say, for the record, that she was treated with great honor and people respected her and treated her very well in terms of the culture of the tribe. That's another aspect, as I pointed out, the hospitality, the sense of culture. So they're taking revenge, but that does not mean they demean the individual. So these are some characteristics of the tribe. I had done a PhD study in tribal societies. My PhD was called Pushtun Economy and Society. This is from SOAS. And I had taken the Momand tribe, which is in Pakistan, and I had studied the Momand living in the tribal areas and the Momand living in the settled areas. So instead of before and after, I took one tribe and looked at them simultaneously to see what impact the settled condition had on the tribe in terms of their rights to passage, in terms of their customs, in terms of what they call rivaj, which is custom, which is very important for the tribe. So that was my link to the tribal areas, and of course the fact that I was posted in tribal areas in Balochistan as commissioner, as a political agent in South Waziristan, which was considered possibly the most famous of all the tribes, tribal areas and agencies, because it contained two of the fiercest, absolutely incredible tribes, the Wazir and the Masood. And one of the problems Pakistan is having even today is their lack of handling the Masood. And then, of course, you have Balochistan, and again, Pakistan's handling of Balochistan, again, a tribal society. This also is part of the definition of the tribe, that very often they are misunderstood, they are demonized, they are held in contempt by the city dwellers, by the people who are running central governments. And this is a problem, because this is linked to the notion I discussed in my work of the conflict between the central government, and the periphery, which is the tribe. So when we talk about tribes, Raza, we talk about tribes, not just the Pathans and the Baloch. They're right across the Muslim world. There are tribes in Morocco, the Sahrawi, right on the borders of Morocco in the Sahara Desert. Then across North Africa and the Middle East, you have the Bedouin, and you have these famous tribes going back centuries. And then, of course, in our part of the world, you've got Afghanistan is very tribal in its society. So it is crucial for central governments not to get involved in this paradigm, the center versus the peri, which unfortunately it is. And now in the modern era, the central governments are discovering mineral resources in these areas. So this exacerbates the tension. You see, Balochistan is a very rich province with a lot of mineral resources, and all these tribal areas, the periphery, in Xinjiang, as you know, in China, it's rich in mineral resources. Again, you have tension there. This is right across in Morocco, the Sahrawi, again, mineral resources. So you have a distinct category of society, the tribe that we are discussing, and you have the central government not fully understanding it. And for example, your viewers, if you ask them, we're talking about Pathans or Pashtuns, the Pashtuns very often soften the khe, Pushtun or Pashtun in the southern belt. If you ask the average person, what do you know about the Pathans? They may say, well, Imran Khan or Shahid Afridi or someone like that, very well-known Pathan figures. But then few people know, they may even say President of Pakistan, Ayub Khan. Few people know that the President of India was a Pathan, Zakir Hussain. The Pathans who are superstars in Bollywood films like Madhubala, many other major figures today, Shah Rukh Khan, they are Pathans who gave dynasties, entire dynasties, ruling from Delhi. So you had the whole Lodhis and Khiljis and Suris and so on. And it was a Pathan dynasty which almost toppled, in fact, did topple the Mughal Empire. And then they were able to restore it. Shah Suri actually toppled them, and a very capable administrator. So you have a category of society not fully understood by the majority and very often in tension, and the need to understand them, because without this understanding, we will have continued problems. So we go into the tribes traditionally, which is what we are talking about. I pointed out my own links. I have some admiration and some affection for the tribes, because not only do I have an academic and professional interest in them and admiration for them, but also a personal one, because my mother is a Barakzai Pathan, so originally from Kandahar, the daughter of Sir Hashmatullah Khan. So it gives me a sense of affiliation and the need really to try to explore and explain these particular people, because what I read in the press is very distorted. And it wasn't held by the British, who sometimes treated the Pathans or the tribes with contempt and sometimes romanticized them. There was this aspect also. So, your Rudyard Kipling now, his most famous novel is Kim. And who's the hero?
Yeah.
Mehboob Ali, again a Pathan, very dashing Pathan. Who's the main figure in the Jungle Book? Is Sher Khan. And who is Sher Khan? He's a Pathan. So you see, right through literature, you have these. And then there was the romanticization in Hollywood. One of the most glorious films of Sean Connery. I don't know whether you saw it, Raza, but a film called The Wind and the Lion. It's
Yes, yes.
So this is a Berber in North Africa. So, Sean Connery plays Raisuli, Berber chief, and he plays him to perfection. And I wrote about this, and I said, one day if he were to play a Baloch chief, because they're Baloch chiefs, if you remember the photographs of Nawab Akbar Bukti, and these very handsome, tall, with their big beards and their very impressive looking costumes, guns and knives and so on. I said that Sean Connery would be a perfect actor to portray someone like the Nawab. So this portrayal continues, and it just underlines the importance of trying to understand this particular category without having problems. When you talk of problems, take President Musharraf, how he ended up by killing Nawab Bukti, who was one of the giants. You may approve of him or disapprove. Many people didn't like him, even in Balochistan, but no one could deny the fact that this man was a giant. And the way he was killed, and I had the pleasure of knowing him personally when I was Commissioner Sibi. So his death and the way he was killed, and then this sort of humiliation of his body and the way his family was treated, I felt really ashamed that the central government behaving like this was one of the key figures of a major figure of tribal society in Balochistan. So again, it's a question of cultural sensitivity. And that touches on my point about the central government and the center versus periphery tensions that you're seeing in society.
Right. This is so fascinating. I mean, what a grand review of this term and its various dimensions. You bring in history and cinema and tribal, cultures, and of course things that are known to us very closely, but also things are far and wide. So, Dr. Akbar Ahmed, what is also important to remember here is that, as you know, when we grow up and we get engaged with a lot of writings on Muslims and by Muslims, the term ummah also crops up all the time. So it's this idealized notion of a universal community of Muslims beyond borders, beyond nation states, etc. And many say it's an idealistic term. It doesn't really mean anything. Some say no, it is a real, goal to be achieved. So can you elaborate a bit on that? And how does it fit or conflict with the notion of Asabiyyah?
Raza, excellent question. Excellent question. It's a technical question, but has a philosophic base to it. My book on tribes is called The Thistle and the Drone. And this book studies 40 case studies right across the Muslim world, from Morocco through North Africa into the Middle East and into Central Asia. Now, my conclusion was, in answer to your question, how does the tribe relate to the notion of the ummah? Because the ummah is a universal concept of Islam. So everyone within Islam is part of this ummah and they feel for each other. But the tribe is very particular. It's based in the lineage, it's based in the shajara. We pointed out it creates its own Asabiyyah for itself. That is the notion of the tribe. And the ummah is something outside it. And it's amazing that the Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him, in the 7th century was aware of this. So early on in Islam, we are talking now the 6th and 7th centuries of Muslim history, right at the source of Muslim history, the Prophet had said, there is no Bedouinism, that is, there is no tribalism in Islam. Because he is aware that Islam is by definition universal. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, in fact, the God of all the universes. He's not just the God of the Muslims. Whereas the tribe is very much particular, the descendants of one ancestor. They are specific to that shajara. And there you have the clash. So very often you may have a tribe, some members belonging to the ummah because they're Muslim, and some members not. And tribes are crossing borders all the time. That's one of the great banes of modernity. When I was PA Waziristan. See, these areas are called after the tribe. It's the land of the Wazir. Saudi Arabia's name, the name of Saudi, that's the tribe,
Correct.
the land of the Saudi tribe. Balochistan, the land of the Baloch. So I was very conscious that half my Wazir tribes were in Pakistan, half were in Afghanistan. So obviously, as my thesis, Pushtun Economy and Society showed, that over time, these tribes begin to develop different characteristics when they're living in different states, because the habits of the states infuse with them. Similarly with the notion of the ummah. And that is why those who understand this tribal structure are able to, Raza, I would say, are able to even exploit it. For example, let me give you an example from contemporary Pakistan. The militant groups in Pakistan today who are very active again, they're reactivated. You will notice that their targets are the three pillars of tribal society. So they're targeting the tribal chiefs, the mashar, the elder of the lineage. They're targeting the representative of government, whether it's the political agent or the tehsildar, and they're targeting the religious leaders, the imam, the mullah, and so on. Now, these are the three pillars on which rested tribal society. They implemented the notion of Asabiyyah and the tribe and balanced it with the notion of the state and the ummah. But when you destroy these three pillars, as the TTP have tried to do, and very successfully, I know that in Waziristan, when I wrote this book, I was told that something like 600 of the elders, the masharan, have been killed, which is a huge number. It's like cutting off the head of a human being, decapitating the head. And the result is that this tribal code that comes out of Asabiyyah and comes out of the tribe, which we call Pukhtunwali amongst the Pathan, and Balochiyat amongst the Baloch, and Nokchala amongst the Chechen. Every tribe has its own code, which again reflects honor and culture and the notion of revenge. This code is then breaking down. And this code is then mutated. So then the chivalry or the courage or the honor is turned into a very virulent concept of taking revenge. And that is why you see some of the shocking acts of brutality. You see women being attacked, children being attacked, schools being attacked. You remember that terrible incident in Peshawar with over 140 children and staff being killed. You remember the attack on GHQ with officers being shot in the cantonment. That is a result of the mutation of the code of the tribe that we're talking about. So this concept is very useful to understand and discuss and keep in mind, because we are seeing the interplay of these different systems.
Right. Very interesting. And, this takes me to the next question. And, your very important book, I remember, known as The Thistle and the Drone, How America's War on Terror Became a Global War on Tribal Islam. Now, you already explained the tribal part to us, and I would like you to speak a little bit about your book, which also deals with, I remember it has many case studies and how the United States got embroiled into these tribal societies, which were on the peripheries, as you say, of the center in many of these societies. And during that process, the U.S. war, or so-called war on terror, turned into a global war on tribal Islam. And, resultantly, we know that, civilians and children through drone attacks were targeted. So talk a bit about that, how that has impacted, coming to the more contemporary times. And I hope that, our viewers can also get this important perspective on why this has been so problematic and why the results have been very mixed. In fact, I would say have have faced failure. In fact, in so many places, Afghanistan, Yemen, even now, and other parts. So maybe let's hear a bit about that.
Very important, Raza. Thank you for raising this issue because, again, I don't think many people in Pakistan are fully aware of the nuances of this discussion. The war on terror very quickly shifted to the tribal areas. And why was that? For two reasons. One, there was a general lack of knowledge, as we are discussing. And secondly, central governments adroitly, very cleverly, shifted the argument and explained to the Americans that in fact it's a conflict between these people, the so-called miscreants or terrorists living in the country, like in Pakistan, they would point to the tribal areas. And therefore, their own problems with the tribal areas or the periphery, that was converted into the war on terror. So that Americans began to feel that those who opposed the central government were in fact opposing the USA. And I found it fascinating that you got sometimes completely innocent people being blown up and shot by these drones, which was a new introduction into warfare in the tribal areas. And I'll give you an example. It's in the book, The Thistle and the Drone. I quoted the brigadier who was actually there on the spot in North Waziristan. When he said, he described it to me, it's I gave the details in the book. He said, I was 10 miles from Tata in North Waziristan, where these local Wazir tribesmen had formed a jirga meeting to solve a tribal war, to settle tribal conflict. So they were meeting for this, about 40 of them, and suddenly there was a drone strike and they were all killed. So you see, that sort of thing was happening. Now, who was there to check? Because in fact, the report that would have gone is that in fact they're all terrorists. So they were just being dismissed as terrorists simply because they were coming from the tribal areas. Waziristan is another example. Now I know Waziristan, I know the Masood tribe, I know the Wazir tribe. Wazir and Masood both became involved in this war on terror. And Waziristan became the most droned region in the world.
Right.
And they would say, these tribes would say that for us, every day is like 9/11. And think of it, what was happening. They are involved in tribal war. Wazir and the Masood are very often in conflict. This is another thing about tribal society, the notion of agnatic rivalry, which means you have an enmity with the father's children. So your father's brother's children, your chacha's children are constantly in conflict with you. This is the structure of tribal society. And very often you'll see this in the Punjab and the Sindh. There's problems about land and marriage and all these other social features. So here we are. One day you are in conflict with your fellow tribesmen. Next day you are being drawn from above. Next day the central government sends its troops to knock you out. And the next day you may have regional powers, Afghanistan playing its great game or India sending its agents across the border. So people there really lived, as they said, every day was 9/11. And that turbulence, Raza, has destroyed the three pillars I talked about: the leadership, religious leaders, and central government authority, which virtually ceased to exist. So we have a long way ahead to restore some kind of a structure and to bring some kind of peace, because without that, you have a huge part of the Muslim world. Go back to the thesis in the Thistle and the Drone. This swathe moves from Morocco across North Africa into the Middle East, Central Asia. This entire region is what we could call tribal. And these were areas which for centuries had a society, had stability, they had leaders, they had a rhythm of life. They implemented, as far as they could with their restrictions, the notions of adl through the jirga, the notions of ilm as much as they could in education, and of course ihsan and compassion through the notion of all belonging to the shajra. But I will point out here, Raza, that I'm idealizing things as a scholar, but the treatment of women is very often far from satisfactory, because whereas Islam gives women rights to inherit property, even to divorce, that is unthinkable in the tribal areas, because there it's a patriarchy and women have virtually, they are living in a sidelined in the margins.
Yes, Dr. Ahmed, I also want to raise this issue with you. You know, this is a very intriguing kind of a concept, and it also shows, if after reading your book and now hearing you again, it's now coming back to me. So, my immediate response was that there is no monolith Muslim or Muslim community because it is all very diverse. It is very, it has some ethnic, tribal, clannish, linguistic differences. And what has happened today in let's say, in our modern societies, especially in the West, is that Muslims are all lumped together as a monolith and turned into an object of ridicule or hate, etc. And we will talk about that in our succeeding discussions, on the issue of Islamophobia. But what I'm hearing about the notions of community and identity, so it is all very diverse, right? I mean,
It
the
is
sense.
very, very, Raza, again, in terms of categories, and as you know, we social scientists are constantly creating categories so that we're able to better understand society. And even, say, Pakistan, which is a fascinating case study, you'll see their irrigated lands, their peasant groups, their agricultural groups, mainly in the Punjab. Also tribal, with the tribal base, the Jats, the Rajputs, and so on. They have their code of honor and they have a very glorious historical background. You have the Sindh, again, very rich culture, again, with their own background. And then you have, across the river Indus, the Indus districts, you have straightforward tribal societies. And of course, in Balochistan, that's recognized because you had the Buktis and the Maris with their own agencies. And this is a characteristic of the tribes, that there's no state law, there's no central government law. So they have their own tribal law, tribal rivaj, tribal customs. So in the tribal areas, they've been absorbed now recently into Pakistan. But until then, there was no central government law. Very often when I'd ask the tribal elders, why don't you want the Pakistani police or the Pakistani revenue official to come and work amongst you? They would laugh. They would say, you really want a corrupt policeman to come and supervise over us, or the Patwari to come and bring his corruption here? We want to be left alone to our own customs. And this reminded me of a brilliant conversation with Sir Evelyn Howell, who happened to be also in charge of Waziristan under the British days. He wrote a beautiful book called Mij, which in Pashto, in Masood Pashto, means we the Masood. He has a conversation with a Masood elder. And they're very impressive, these tribes, and very impressive. They look you in the eye, talk as equals. Remember, the Shajara is equal. It creates equality. There is no high or low. We are all equal because we all belong to one genealogy. And they're discussing civilization. And this Masood elder tells Evelyn Howell, he says, a civilization must be judged by the kind of man it produces. And on that basis, we are the most superior people and the most superior civilization. And Evelyn Howell says, now this is an Englishman who belonged to the old ICS, IPS cadre, who said, I could not but help, right at the end, he doesn't tell the Masood there, but he writes in his little book, he says, I could not but help agree with the Masood elder. That he's agreeing that the Masood tribe has its own way of conducting society, organizing society, and they're producing this very impressive individual and the type of leadership, and this is superior to us, the British. So this is their concept, and what has happened in the meantime is that has been broken. That's been broken because of this turmoil, and it's like a very complicated clock, and unless you put it together again, it's not going to be so easily fixed. I'm using this metaphor because it shows you the complexity of tribal society and what a beautiful structure it was and how it lasted so long. But that is now in a state of disrepair and is creating and will continue to create a lot of serious problems. And as you said, the image then becomes internationally of a very negative image of Muslims, because very often people take a shot or photo shot of a tribesman with a beard and shalwar kameez and a gun on his shoulder, and they say, this is how all Muslims are. they're all violent and they're ignorant and they're misogynist, and they use that as an image of Muslims. And you're right, in that sense, they're all categorized and lumped into one.
Very true, very true. And that's, we will pick on this thread later. Dr. Akbar, thank you very much for joining me on this important discussion. And I hope that the viewers and the listeners, if they're on podcast, or just hearing the audio, would learn from this and engage with this. And please feel free to leave your comments and questions if needed, and we'll get back to you. With that, I thank you again. Goodbye.